Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about something really cool. We're going to talk about the rich friend concept that is discussed in depth by Chelsea Fagan over on the Financial Diet, but we're going to look at it from the perspective of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so let's delve into this. This is a really fascinating concept. So Chelsea Fagan is brilliant financial commentator, and she looks at American finance from the perspective of American culture, right? And she talks a lot about the rich friend. And what she's talking about is increasingly there are people who are friends. And what if you have a rich friend, and then we don't want to say poor, because we're just going to say poor for the purposes of the construct, right? Or the purposes of getting to the point, okay? You have a rich friend and a poor friend, right? And the rich friend is like, so it's wedding season, right? And the rich friend is like, we're both going to be bridesmaids in this girl's, wedding, right? And now, and they say it like this is no big deal. For the rich friend, it is no big deal, right? They're paying $150 just for a blowout for their hair. They're paying $200 for their shoes. They're paying $700 for a dress. And soon it's $1,000, $2,000 just to be a bridesmaid, right? And for the rich friend, it's nothing, right? But the rich friend assumes that the poor friend's all in, but that person is like struggling to keep up financially, right? And so what Chelsea Fagan says is, if you're the rich friend, especially at like wedding season, right? But it's all year, right? You either have to change your behavior. You need to say, oh, you know what? Let's not do that. Let's tell our friend, sorry, we can't do this because, not both of us have $2,000 to be a bridesmaid, right? And so you as the rich friend are saying, I'm going to do less, right? So that my poor friend doesn't feel left out. That's part of it. Or you as the rich friend very graciously, when you go, you say, hey, let's both do this. And I know there's going to be some financial burden here, but I'm going to do the lift for both of us. I'm going to take care of everything. Right? And you're going to try to do that as graciously as you can, right? But it's really important. And Chelsea Fagan is talking about a major thing here that you don't hear, like economists talk about. And it's a really big deal. She is interacting with finance differently than most economists, right? She's talking about the cultural impact, right? Well, let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Let's talk about my channel, right? So I've realized this, right? I get people who roll up in the comments and they're often vexed, they're often confused, they're often just like affronted, right? Literally offended, right? And they're like, what are you saying, Scott? And I get it. And I'm getting it more every day. I'm starting, see, and again, Gary Gygax, man, he's like, hey, listen, you are no longer human. You are an entity that is different, and you will never, ever, once you engage with Dungeons and Dragons and you understand what it actually is, you will never interact with identity the same way. You will never interact with narrative the same way, and you will never interact with language the same way, right? And I want to talk about the language, and the language is simply illustrating the truth, okay? You can go play Dungeons and Dragons. If you want to do that, you should not be here. If you want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I'm begging you to leave my channel, right? Because it is going to do nothing but offend you, confuse you, and upset you, okay? If you want to play Dungeons and Dragons, you should go elsewhere. You should go to the Dungeon Dudes. The Dungeon Dudes are going to give you covered, right? You can play Dungeons and Dragons forever with the Dungeon Dudes advice, right? It's comfortable. It will never strain you. You'll never struggle to understand what they're saying, right? You'll never be uncomfortable, right? I'm not talking about playing Dungeons and Dragons. I'm talking about journeying with Dungeons and Dragons, right? So you as the Dungeon Master are going to change, and at every single session, you will be changing the lives permanently of every player at that table. You will never, ever leave a single player unchanged after a session of Dungeons and Dragons with you, right? And that means that you are journeying with Dungeons and Dragons. What does that mean? It means you are going on a personal journey. You will use Dungeons and Dragons not as a game, but as a tool to cut if you want to use Dungeons and Dragons as a game to cut more goblins in half and roll on some, random encounter tables, right? Go with God. The dungeon dude's got you covered. Okay? If you want to journey with Dungeons and Dragons, if you want to change yourself and change every single person at your table because you see Dungeons and Dragons as a tool to cut your own deficiencies in half, or as Joe Manganiello said, transform your own life and the culture you live in, right? Then this is where you should be, journeying with Dungeons and Dragons. And with Dungeons and Dragons itself, the product and the brand and the experience is changing. It's changing. It's always changing. And you're always hearing me as I'm like, hey, it's not cool to play D&D 1E. It's not cool to play D&D 2E. It's not cool to play D&D 3E. It's not cool to play D&D 4E. You play D&D now and nothing else, right? And here's why, right? So, like, when you go on a journey, right, you get in your car, you put it in gear, and you move. You actually move, right? That's D&D 5e. You are actually moving. You are experiencing the real world. If you're playing an old version of Dungeons and Dragons, what you're doing is you're doing what Hollywood does, right? You're putting your car there, and then there's a scrolling background, right? And the background scrolls, and it looks like movement, but nothing's changing. And there's no movement, there's no momentum, there's no change for anyone, not you or not any of your players, right? Because you're by saying, I will not accept Dungeons and Dragons now. I don't want to go on a cultural journey. I don't want to learn. I don't want to change. I don't want to be uncomfortable ever, right? You are pretending to move, right? You're not going on a journey with Dungeons and Dragons. That's what I'm doing here, right? Every other channel on the YouTube will tell you how to play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm telling you how to journey with Dungeons and Dragons. And those are not the same thing. They are not the same thing, right? So I wanted you to understand that. Okay, so once we understand all that, right, let's talk about the rich friend. What you now need to understand, and let's just keep this at the player level. We don't even need to go to the dungeon master level, which is even more complex than what I'm about to explain with players. So if you have a dungeon master who is journeying with Dungeons and Dragons, and every single session is designed to improve them and you, right? Let's say, so what's going to happen is you are about to go on a journey. You are about to be fundamentally changed as a person, right? You're going to interact with identity, narrative, and language in a way that most normal humans don't even have any concept of, right? But what is your capacity then? What is the currency you pay for that journey with? There's three currencies. Three currencies, right? When you travel, right, you go from the America and you have the USD. And then you get to Europe and you have the Euro, right? Two currencies, right? And then you go to Japan and you have the yen, three currencies. What are the currencies you pay for your journey with Dungeons and Dragons on, right? You pay for it with three currencies. Your intellectualism, your emotionalism, and your spirituality, right? And what if you're the rich friend? What if you have a deep intellectual capacity? This is not intelligence, right? This is, hey, I want to learn something new, right? I want knowledge I didn't have before, and I'm also willing to unlearn my prejudices, some of my beliefs, right? Intellectualism is an ability to unlearn, relearn, or to experience knowledge that might not even be accepted by the cultural masses at this point. That's intellectual courage. That's a deep intellectual capacity. You have the fat roll, you have hundreds, right? Hundreds, right? Like 20 grand in your hand, right? Because you got 200, 100 bills, right? You see what I'm saying, right? And $100 bills, 200 Benjamins, right? You have intellectual capacity. You have the currency, right? Next, you got emotional capacity, right? Are you able to what happens if your player character dies, right? And you've been playing that character for 6 months, and you have been transforming your own life and impacting the culture around you because of what you're experiencing at the Dungeons and Dragons table. But then you lose your character, right? That could be emotionally devastating. But you're thick, right? You got emotional thickness, right? You have almost like in the wintertime when people would feast and they would use the fat from the feast, right? Do you have an emotional thickness, right? Do you have an emotional store to use for when you become poignantly sad because of the loss of a Dungeons & Dragons character? And you're never going to see this on other tabletop role-playing games. They just don't get there. I'm telling you right now, they don't. Because they weren't grounded in this incredibly special thing that Gary built, right? There's never been anyone like Gary until Amanda Heyman. I think she's kind of the second Gary. But that's let me stay focused. All right, spirituality, right? I'm an evangelical Christian. My turtle wizard Beryl, right? He was faithless, right? And actually, he would go into any city he was in, and immediately, because he was flush with coin, because he was a baller adventurer, he would go to the temple and he would give gold to whatever god was the most powerful, was the most worshipped god in that city. And he would interact with the clerics and he would get a blessing from them, right? But he didn't care if that blessing was, he didn't care, excuse me, who the true God was, right? He didn't really care who the true God was. Excuse me. He just cared about getting a blessing so that maybe he would, and it literally happened, right? The dungeon master would say, you're inspired, right? And he was coming from that thing like, oh, it doesn't matter if the God's real, or if the God really even knows who you are, or if, maybe that cleric was a thief, and that went in his pocket and never even made it in, and the ting you heard in the pot was just a rock. You know what I mean? Like, and so, but it was hard for me to like play this godless turtle, right? And it challenged me spiritually, right? Dungeons and Dragons can challenge you spiritually. That's not me saying it. Professor Dungeon Master said that last year. That Dungeons and Dragons can be a spiritual experience. It deals with pantheons. It deals with gods. It deals with your worship. Clerics are on the cutting edge of deities giving things to people, right? Truly deep, truly deep. So this is the point, right? You're going to find yourself in a Dungeons and Dragons game like this if you're on this channel and you are listening or doing anything I say. You're going to end up here, right? Where you realize I have a fat roll of intellectualism. I have a fat roll of intellectual currency. I have a fat roll of emotional currency. I have a fat roll of spiritual currency. But this person doesn't. They're bereft, right? They have like coins. Not even hundreds, not even Benjis. Then how do you adjust that, right? How do you bring them along and start to use your intellectual, emotional, and spiritual currency to Sherpa this person? Oh, you know what? I'm not sure. Is that an appropriate term still? I don't know. It might not be. If it's wrong, I apologize. So to carry up, right? And if anybody knows if Sherpa, I love that term, but if it's inappropriate now, I apologize. Let me know if that's not correct to use anymore. I've heard these stories of Sherpas like literally carrying up these, coastal elites to the top of the mountain. I don't think that's derisive, but it is. Please let me know. So to carry someone up the mountain, right? You're going to have to carry them up the mountain, and you're going to have to pay for them, right? And how do we even do this? And this is what I keep telling you. Dungeons and Dragons isn't like anything on the planet, right? How do you pay with your intellectualism? How do you pay with your emotionalism? How do you pay with your spirituality to take someone on a journey they might not even understand they're going on? This is Dungeons and Dragons when you journey with Dungeons and Dragons and you have stopped playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I just want to tell you, some of you, I love you to death, but yet you say you love Dungeons and Dragons and you play Dungeons and Dragons, but you haven't bought a D&D canon hardback in 5 years, right? Do you just have the background scrolling? You see what I'm saying? Right? Are you actually moving? Right? Are you journeying with Dungeons and Dragons? Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.